that we're launching the report tomorrow. So I don't want there to feel bad. You've got the head start. Yeah, this is a pre-launch for friends and colleagues. And this is a public event tomorrow. I think you have to have some form of accreditation. But if you are going to be at the Social Star, we'll be doing all of this again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Yeah. In the Heron Room at 2 p.m. inside the Berkshire Hotel. So thank you very much for coming. We're here at Civicus, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation, and I hope Civicus doesn't need an introduction to most people, particularly from South Africa, but thank you to Civicus colleagues for hosting us. And in a second, I'm going to hand over to Mandeep Tiwari, who's the Secretary General of Civicus, just to say a few words. Immediately after Mandeep, we'll have Gilad Isaacs, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for Economic Justice, talking a bit about the G20 wider context and a little bit about the report. And then my own colleague from NEF, Fernanda Balata, is going to talk about what's in the report. And then we'll go to a panel discussion, and then we'll have a Q&A and discussion with you all. Throughout the whole event, there will continue to be snacks and soft drinks and tea and coffee outside. So please help yourself if you get peckish or thirsty. And so without further ado, Mandeep, maybe I can hand to you.
Thanks, Danny. It's a pleasure to be reconnected with you, and greetings, everyone, and welcome to our home in Johannesburg. As Danny mentioned, I'm Mandeep Tiwari. I'm the Secretary General of Civicus as of the 1st of June, and I'm delighted to be here. So first of all, I'd just like to congratulate the authors of the G20 at a Crossroads report. I think it's timely, and look forward to hearing more about the findings. The G20, if you look at it, is a complex beast. The states that make up the G20 have very little in common as far as worldviews are concerned, as far as political systems are concerned. They don't even like each other. Yet they're arrogated themselves to be what is called the shares of the financial world. And they take decisions for the rest of the world, which impact many vulnerable and excluded peoples, but are oftentimes taken in their own self-interest. And that's where lies the irony of the current state of the world we are in. In fact, the G20 is no different from our societies around the world, where 20 years of neoliberal economic discourse and the push towards multi-stakeholder approaches towards governance have created a situation where we have state capture of institutions by oligarchs in almost every country of the world. We are now currently at 19th century levels of inequality. So, if you look at the G20 again, I mean, the G20 in itself has failed to address the things that were promised by world leaders in the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, which is arguably the greatest ever human endeavor to create peaceful, just, equal, and sustainable societies. Today, we have $2.7 trillion in military spending, which causes innumerable suffering to people around the world, but it also creates immense profits for private actors within G20 countries. It also causes immense environmental harms, while at the same time, that money could be used to provide sustenance to the 700 million or so people by conservative estimates that go to bed hungry every night. We have individuals who can afford to send up rockets into space for fun. We are individuals who can buy seats on rockets at astronomical prices, or which, if collectively taken together, could improve the lives of tens of thousands, if not millions of people around the world and provide them their basic needs. And this is here our job in civil society really is to humanize the work of the G20, to make sure that the G20 works for people at large, that the gap between the rhetoric and the reality is narrowed down. But the G20 also does not take civil society very seriously. In our research at Civicus, through the Civicus Monitor, which is a participatory research collaboration to measure civic freedoms around the world, 10 out of the 90 G20 states have obstructed civic space conditions. That means they don't really take civil society very seriously. 6 of these have depressed and closed civic space conditions, where the mere act of speaking truth to power, to towards uncovering corruption or serious human rights violations, or if you seek transformative change in societies. Can land you into prison for a long period of time. It can get you killed. It can get your reputation destroyed. It can get your family intimidated and so on. And that is as of today. In fact, the civic space conditions and G20 countries are declining so fast that there will be further changes, which we will be releasing in our People Power Under Attack report in December this year. And we live in bizarre times. And it's our work as civil society, we see that we really have to push for creating the momentum for more peaceful, just, equal, and sustainable societies by getting the G20 to do better. And that's why our work in civil society is also an exercise in radical optimism, because we all here, because we believe that a better world is possible. With that said, thank you for the opportunity to share these brief introductory remarks. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to hearing more about the report and also the conversations that follow.
Thanks very much, colleagues. And Mandeep, thank you for hosting us at Civicus. I have a few I'm not going to speak to much of the report itself. I've got a few roles. The first is to sort of welcome everyone from the South African partner of the consortium, but actually I wanted to use the opportunity to also welcome the partners who we've been collaborating with to South Africa, and say what a pleasure it's been to have this very broad partnership. The second is to set the scene a little bit. I'm going to start by just sharing a short summary on the role that we've played this year, and that's not to center our institute, but I'm going to explain why that's relevant. So the IEJ, where I work, has been a resource partner to the Sherpa and has been an active member of the secretariat of 2 of the 3 task forces this year, 4 of the working groups, is a drafting party to the leaders' declaration, and has played a kind of support role to the Sherpa and the secretariat. And the reason I mention this is to say that this has kind of given us front row, if somewhat obscured front row seats to how the sausage is made, right? The G20 sausage making process. And that's kind of what I want to share a bit about, and some of my reflections on that as the scene setting input. And that's, I think, left me caught somewhere between frustration and disappointment on the one hand, and some level of hope and enthusiasm on the other. Those who have engaged with over the course of the last few months might be surprised to hear about the hope and enthusiasm element. But it was this morning when we were on a panel that was launching or speaking about the G20 inequality report, and Jati Ghosh, who I think many of you would know, who is a professor at UMass Amherst and a colleague, comrade, friend of many of us here, was quite effusively kind of complimentary of the South African leadership in this G20 process. And Jati, someone whose opinion I take really seriously, right? This is not someone who I think doesn't have the political insights around what's going on, and it was really interesting. I mean, her window, of course, onto the G20 has primarily been through the inequality report, which has had enormous support by the South African government. And it's the first time that the G20's really tackled something like inequality. It's provided the platform for ideas which one would normally read about in sort of civil society reports. So I see that these sort of, the starting point often in these conversations is the 4 global South presidencies that have sort of followed from each other, and how that's brought a renewed progressive agenda. And, I see that. At the same time, I guess our somewhat obscured front row seats to the sausage making has also left us with a clear sense of the many promises unfulfilled in this process, right? The sort of hand waving that the South African government and other governments have undertaken towards progressive ideals, but where substantive progress hasn't really been made. And I think the story of sort of debt is, which I'm going to speak to more about the report later, but I guess is somewhat emblematic of that, right? This is the first G20 on Africa, in Africa, in many ways, the development challenge that's holding back climate progress, that's holding back development progress continentally, is the over indebtedness of African countries and the looming debt crisis. And the story there is quite interesting and emblematic of what I want to touch on briefly. And that story is one of some of us from about June last year trying to convince the government stakeholders that debt should sort of feature as a key priority, producing various concept notes, trying to frame it in various ways, and over the course of sort of June to October, generally being stonewalled, okay, in particular by the National Treasury in South Africa. The president, to his credit, decided in cabinet right towards the end that he was going to insist that there's something that sort of touches on this, and that was going to be the cost of capital commission, which was put into the concept note at the last minute, and we tried to finesse it in there and make it fit and whatever, and that represented a kind of a good sort of leadership by the South African president. Unfortunately, what transpired then was a huge backlash by the whole finance track, which basically said, there's absolutely no way that commission focusing on that could happen anywhere outside of the finance track, and a slow clawing back of it. And eventually, the cost of capital became a sub-theme within the Africa Expert Panel report that would focus on African development, which we still await. And to me, what the story illustrates, which Mandeep, I think, sort of started on, is that the G20 is a contested space, right? And I think it's useful, before we get to the report itself, to understand some of those players. And some of those players have come across in this brief sort of story that I've told. So who are the chess pieces here on the G20 sort of board? Well, firstly, there's 4 main parts of our governments that are involved, which often work at cross purposes and are competing against each other, which is the foreign offices, the line departments on particular issues like health or education or various topics, the presidencies, and the ministries of finance and central banks. In general, the first 2 tend to have a more progressive sort of outlook. The presidencies are really impacted by the sort of politics of the state at the time, and the finance departments and central banks are kind of the holders of the neoliberal orthodoxy. The sort of second dimension is that you get a schism according to the bureaucrats and the politicians, which also emerges, right? Where the two are not always on the same page, and in which the bureaucracy and the politicians can pool in various ways. The third is the schisms between the global north and the global south, across, as Mandeep said, this collection of nations who, really often don't have shared interests. And I'm going to be another 2 or 3 minutes, yeah. The fourth sort of schism, and most people fall into the group of kind of creditors, and that's an important sort of categorization, I think, to categorize G20 the countries, right? That almost all G20 countries in the global financial architecture are creditors, with a small group of some type. Yeah. The fifth schism is between the sort of the social conservatives of the Saudis, the backlash which we've seen from India, from Argentina, and a more sort of social progressive. And the sixth schism is between the international, the IOs, the civil society, and the governments that are involved in this playing field. And so really with all of those pieces on the board, it's a surprise that the G20 gets anything done at all, really, right? And it's forced us, I think, to really think about what does success look like for the G20, which is the last thing I'll touch upon in these opening comments, because I'm out of time. And success, I think, has at least 3 different levels. There's success in sort of declarations and the textual success, that these ministers said this, or these presidents said this. At its strongest, those can instruct international institutions, particularly groups like the OECD, the international organizations, the FSB, the international financial institutions, to actually do things in their sort of strongest way. More often what you're doing is really mainstreaming an idea through the platform or the megaphone of the G20. And lastly, I think the G20 is this kind of incubating space, right? So we've been doing work on food buffer stocks, right? Which 3 of the audience members were involved in, and you got a legitimacy for the idea, and now the AEU's running with that, and we're doing work with them on that. So it's this kind of incubation space. And the value to come to the report is, I think that this report, it doesn't approach the sort of chessboard in this way or success in this way, but I think it does a really good job. And I mean, I say that as an author, but I had almost no contribution to it. So this is really a reflection on those who did the hard work. But I think it does a really good job of assessing, how these different players on this board, with all of their limitations, to what extent has success really occurred in those different areas. And I think moving forward, we also need to assess to what extent is the G20 sort of structurally inhibited from actually being able to have the kinds of successes which we want. So I wanted to just provide a kind of a sort of lay of the G20 land as I think we've experienced it this year. And I'm going to hand over to Fernando, who's been who's written this with a range of co-authors, but has really been the sort of pen holder of this process, who's going to talk us through some of the findings of that, and then we're going to move on to a conversation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Gilad. Let me know if you can't hear me. I'm going to try and project. Yeah, it's really great to be here. It's my first time in South Africa and in Johannesburg, obviously. But it's, really important moment, not just because we're launching our very special collaboration report, but, it's, as we know, we're here because there's global leaders meeting who have power, and also a historic mark for the G20 in its 20th summit. And also a moment, I guess, across the world. I mean, I'm from Brazil, lived in the UK, now in Canada, now here. I think everywhere I go, at least, people are asking very overdue questions, facing complex, multiple challenges, and they are deeply connected. And I think our report tried to speak to that as well, as I'll outline to you now. Our report starts with an observation that the G20 sits at a crossroads of purpose, of legitimacy, and of what kind of global future it can help shape. And I'll speak to those three overarching kind of frames. So in relation to purpose, since 2008, the G20 has become the world's main crisis response forum. Banks and markets, panicked, and it acted very fast. So take 2009, the leaders pledged $1.1 trillion in stimulus and liquidity, and they created the Financial Stability Board to tighten oversight of global finance, which meant an acknowledgement of the need to govern global finance. Or take 2020, when the G20 backed the largest ever allocation of special drawing rights at the International Monetary Fund, which provided vital liquidity for many countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think, what we speak to in the report is that this does show that the G20 does have a crisis reflex. It works, but when the crisis is financial, and it works to stabilize the financial markets. When we look at the wider purpose of the G20, it claims to be working towards strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. We get a different story when we assess through that lens. Crises that are shaping people's daily lives, so take soaring debt burdens for low-income nations, unaffordable cost of living, homelessness and forced migration, poor and inadequate access to health and care, ever greater and more frequent climate disasters, work precarity, hunger and malnutrition. These are really the crises that are affecting people everywhere, but they are not receiving the same urgency by G20 leaders. When we talk about the legitimacy of the G20, so the G20 claims legitimacy because of scale. It brings together leaders responsible for about 85% of global GDP, 75% of world trade, and 2/3 of the world's population. But legitimacy isn't only about size, it's also about fairness. And as we know, there's many countries and nations around the world that are not in the room. They're not part of the G20. And even inside the room, as Gilad mentioned as well, the balance of power there's an imbalance of power, with power mostly sitting with the G7 nations that are backed by institutions that they mostly control, such as the IMF and the OECD. And that means that G20 decisions often embed the priorities of those global north creditors, as well as Gilad put. Sometimes the forum undermines its own claims as well. So although, and we'll hear from Marco later, who worked on the climate finance section of our report, how the G20 over the years has embraced the climate agenda. But in 2022, G20 countries provided 1.4 trillion in explicit fossil fuel support. And if we include environmental damages that they didn't price in, the total subsidies hit 7 trillion, or 7.1% of global GDP. And those are figures by the IMF. And that exceeds all global climate finance commitments by orders of magnitude. So again, legitimacy is contested. So we assessed the G20 across 5 major policy areas, and we used 2 lenses. So as I mentioned, we looked at the G20 own stated goal of strong, sustainable, balanced, inclusive growth. And we also looked at whether or not it has advanced economic justice. And our framework around economic justice was looking at things such as fairness, equity, distribution, agency, recognition, and environmental integrity. And across all 5 domains that we looked at, we saw a similar pattern. So I'll just quickly outline some examples of what we found in those 5 domains. So when we look at the international financial architecture and the reform of the IFA, the G20 has mobilized liquidity, but barely touched the deeper power structures. So for example, the IMF voting shares, they still reflect, the post-Second World War context, 1945, and not 2025, where we're at. If you take the African continent, that still holds less than 5% of the vote. In moments of crisis, money flows, but to stabilize markets, as I said, not to support development. That was the other domain that we looked at. Since 2020, there's been G20 initiatives on that restructuring, like the DSSI and the Common Framework, which again, it shows acknowledgement by the G20 of this important issue. But as we looked in our report, private creditors mostly stayed out. And obviously the G20 working consensus also can't really, doesn't have any binding power. But yeah, the mechanisms used kept private creditors out. And to give some examples, Zambia spent nearly half of its government revenue on that service while negotiations were dragging for years. And Ghana's IMF program forced them to freeze do a freeze in public hiring and to cut subsidies, which was really narrowing their fiscal space instead of widening it. So what we saw is that this underlying logic of creditor repayment first remains intact. On tax, the G20 claimed in 2009 to help end banking secrecy, and it has expanded transparency. But efforts to tax large corporations collapsed when the US blocked key reforms, such as Pillar 1. The proposed global minimum corporate tax of 15% is well below the average statutory corporate tax rates in Africa and Latin America, which are typically between 25% and 30%. And what that means is that really you are incentivizing a race to the bottom. And the African Tax Administration Forum, for example, has argued that a global minimum closer to 20% would be better reflective of the needs of low and middle income countries. But on tax, we do highlight, and Maria Emilia will talk to that a bit later, the boldest step came from Brazil last year. The Brazilian presidency put taxation of the super rich on the G20 agenda for the first time. And as I said, we have explored this. It's an evolving legacy. It's very early to say, but it has had an impact, a positive impact, on issues of tax justice. But the political window is fragile. On climate finance, finance flows have grown, but they are still far short of what's needed or what the science demands. Funding is skewed towards profitable mitigation projects, but adaptation receives only a fraction. Loss and damage proposals remain largely symbolic, and worse still, much climate finance arrives as loans, deepening the debt dependence rather than easing it. Finally, on labor, which was the 5th domain that we looked at, labor gets attention, but only when presidencies push for it or unions mobilize strongly. The reality is that across G20 countries, labor share of income in the economy has been falling. Digital platform work expands, but the precariousness of jobs and inadequate protections for workers. And care economies, which are essential to any functioning society, are only now gaining visibility, and very much thanks to the leadership of Brazil and South Africa this year. So, what the assessment gives us is a clear picture that the G20 is detecting symptoms, but avoiding structural causes. Now, the final point I want to make in terms of the findings from the report and the dual lens that we used is that across every domain, there is one missing variable that keeps resurfacing, and that's extreme wealth concentration. And Mandeep did do the opening remarks highlighting some of that as an impact. The world is drifting towards its first trillionaire, and which means it's, an individual or a handful of individuals controlling unsurmountable amounts of wealth and power beyond the level of many sovereign nations. The richest 1% emit as much carbon as the poorest 2/3 of humanity, further exacerbating climate change. During the pandemic, the wealth of the world's 5 richest men doubled, while nearly 5 billion people saw their incomes fall. And despite that context, which it's insane to think of, extreme wealth is barely mentioned in G20 communiques. Whether we look at that rules, the climate finance context, the tax negotiations, apart from Brazil last year, labor rights or financial governance, this gravitational pull of private capital is shaping the outcomes far more than the public purpose is. So it's like trying to measure the climate without acknowledging gravity. Extreme wealth is a structural force. If you don't include it in the analysis, you miss what's really driving the outcomes. So what our report has also done, on a, I guess, more positive note, is look at what else is happening. 2 things. One, the last 4 years of the G20 saw global South countries leading its presidency. And despite all of these constraints, they have been able to prioritize different things in their agendas, which really shows how, once you account for the plurality of the world, beyond the G7, beyond the kind of dominant narrative around global North institutions, you get, for example, Indonesia putting energy transition financing on the agenda, India pushing for digital public infrastructure as a public good, Brazil putting the taxation of super rich on the world stage, and South Africa centering care economies and adaptation, areas that have been long overlooked in global macroeconomic debates. But finally, outside the G20, there are also powerful alternatives emerging. And if you look at our report, you see that we have mapped some of those in the context of the domains that we explored. We looked at the Bridgetown Initiative, that it's reframing climate finance, the UN Tax Convention negotiations, which are underpinned by a drive towards fiscal justice, not just in terms of inclusion of the rest of the world, but also in terms of the issues that it's trying to put in the global tax cooperation agenda. The V20, the group of climate vulnerable states, championing resilience for climate vulnerable economies, regional reserve systems and new development banks, such as the BRICS banks and others, opening new pathways for collective autonomy. And we argue in the report that these are not just peripheral initiatives, they are already shaping global norms. So what needs to change? Our report does also point towards, what's the way forward? And we identify 5 principles for what a different G20 could look like to really address those issues that we identified. Number 1, broadening what counts as a crisis. So climate, inequality, and precarious work are systemic risks, not just moral issues or matters to be put in a social category. And they are also economic matters. Embed justice in crisis response. So the G20 could improve its metrics by focusing on equity, for example, trends in debt service ratios, vaccine access, fiscal space, and extreme wealth concentration. Using soft power to shift norms. So the Brazil case study showed that the G20 can legitimize big ideas like taxing extreme wealth before they become binding rules. Engage coalitions driving real change. So like I said, we focus a lot on identifying alternative visions for the economy that might be happening, notably happening outside of the G20. But the G20 could pay greater attention to that. Take concrete examples like the Bridgetown, Jubilee Debt, the UN Tax Convention, regional reserve funds. And finally, to redefine stability itself. Stability can't just mean financial calm when societies and ecosystems are falling apart and destabilizing. We need to redefine macroeconomic stability to capture real outcomes for people and our planet. So on that, I'll conclude. to say that, so we found through the report that G20 has overseen nearly 2 decades of widening inequities, faltering multilateralism, and lost opportunities for genuine transformation, and also failed to translate its economic weight into structural reform and shared resilience. And the legitimacy is being questioned, and Global South presidencies, while they have injected some new perspectives on key issues, outcomes remain constrained by entrenched asymmetries, voluntary commitments, and declining public trust. So to remain credible in a shifting world order, the G20 can either continue to stabilize a system that is producing deeper inequality, deeper fragility, and ecological risk, or it could reimagine itself as a platform that centers justice, redistribution, and planetary survival. And like I said, the hopeful part, at least that keeps me hopeful, is that we are seeing many of those actors in the international stage and at local and national levels really organizing to new directions that we should really be paying more attention to and helping to legitimize. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to invite 2 more of the co-authors up here to join the panel. Maria Emilia, shall I start with you? So both Gilad and Fernanda talked about tax and tax justice and, and the potential that the G20 has to really coordinate global efforts on taxation or corporate tax, wealth tax, or a bunch of things. And I think Fernanda mentioned in particular that last year, for those of us who were watching the G20 in Brazil, it was particularly exciting to see wealth taxation roll onto the agenda in the Brazilian presidency. I wonder if you could reflect on what you see are the sort of potentials, but also the frustrations around the tax agenda in the G20.
Extreme wealth and taxation at the G20. I would say that the record of the group until last year was silent. The bulk of the G20 work on taxation until the 2024 Brazilian presidency had focused on giving the OECD a mandate to address basically tax abuse by multinational enterprises. So not focused on very rich individuals, but on harmful practice and tax abuse by big corporations. And yet, while the work of the G20 OECD did have some positive outcomes, mostly in promotion to tax transparency, there has been increasing criticism of the OECD dealing with this agenda. The first source of criticism, or we'll just set the common thread to the report we're launching today, has to do with basically lack of inclusivity of the space. It's been widely documented that countries in the global south don't have actual influence or hold a say in decision-making taxation at the OECD. But there been increasingly being critiques focused on the lack of fairness of the outcomes of the OECD work on tax, and on the lack of effectiveness of the work of the OECD around tax. And the examples Fernanda just mentioned on the 2-pillar solution and the limited impacts on this initiatives can have, especially when there's one country that has virtual veto power, in this case, the US, on multilateral solutions, led to increased criticism on this regard. The positive side of the story is that countries from Africa managed to use their leadership and regional coordination to start a new process and an alternative process in a more democratic space, which is the UN. And in my demand, our civil society, take it on CNAS. Now there's an ongoing process to negotiate a binding treaty, a convention, a framework convention on international tax cooperation in the UN. So where does the Brazilian initiative that Tamara just mentioned fit in this conversation? Well, Brazil managed to very successfully change the focus of the conversation on tax in the G20 and to put the issue of inequality and extreme wealth as the very center of the conversations. So during 2024, Brazil, after a very successful diplomacy program, managed to have a broad-breaking and ministerial declaration issued on inequalities and taxation, and also to include the topic in the via leader separation at the very end of last deal. And through this work, the G20 recognized the connection between progressive taxations, equalities, and the need to address inequalities, and basically sustainable development. And what do we learn from this effort? Well, we have a very concrete example of how the G20 should look like if the recommendations that are contained in the report we're launching, how we put into practice. And I identified 4 points which are included, of course, in your report that show us some more concrete learnings that I think all related to Gilat's point at the beginning of the conversation today. One learning has to do with the huge agenda-setting power that the G20 has. The G20 helped normalize the issue of tax and super rich and give visibility to the issue, very high visibility, and just spark conversations on the topic in different fora. Second, this initiative show how the G20 can actually address an issue that is relevant for a global sub-country, of course, with Brazilian leadership, but other global sub-countries kind of supporting Brazil's efforts, but also an issue for which there is kind of popular demand and social demand and civil society advocacy around that. Those issues can easily fit the G20 agenda, and there is room in the group's agenda to address this sort of concerns when there's political will to do so. Third, I think this case is a beautiful example of the potential of collaboration with the G20 and civil society and academia beyond the usual suspects. In this case, Brazil did commission a report to the IMF on the topic of inequalities and taxation, but also a report to the EU tax authority, which ended up showing how super rich are basically undertaxed across countries in the globe. And this was an opportunity to introduce, of course, CSO demand to the tax agenda in the G20, which had to do with supporting the UN Convention on Tax Preparation I just mentioned. This was not initially on the table when Brazil prioritized the issue of taxing super rich, but this collaboration led to these issues being kind of packaged as a demand for tax justice. And finally, the case shows the potential for ramification of agendas from the G20 to other fora, which are more democratic or legitimate. This case shows the example of the topic blending in international, regional, and national agendas very clearly after the G20 with similar language and framing. At the international level, the tax convention in negotiating in UN does include a commitment to tax effectively the super rich, but also the Compromiso Estatista, the outcome document emerging from the last Financing for Development conference in the US, moves forward in the same line of the leaders' declaration in the G20. Regionally, the European Commission, for instance, is exploring the role of these taxes in promoting equality. The PTLAG, that's in America, a regional tax conversion platform, is prioritizing this agenda as well, which is for a very unequal region, best as IO. And we also see national debates and could be policy reforms advancing after the G20 work also to meet the tax reform that Brazil recently passed, which are minimum tax on the wealthiest or higher in emerging countries. I'll leave it there and I'll stay online to see your reaction.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Maria Emilia. So, Marco, let's move to climate finance. You're Brazilian, and Brazil was not only the host of the last G20, but obviously of the COP. I wonder if you could share with us what you think about climate finance and its role in the G20, and again, what are the sort of tensions and contradictions that you see at play in the G20 on climate?
Sure. First of all, thank Danny and thanks Civicus to host this event. I think that climate finance is a specific area that illustrates very well the spirit of this report. I mean, the difficulty for G20 goes to a broader definition of economic stability that includes the new conditionants of macroeconomic stability, like climate finance, like the burden of climate finance, especially for poor countries. So, in one side, climate finance flows concentrated in mitigation, which reflects a major concern on how green technology will be financed and developed by advanced economies and traditional technological players in the global economy. And on the other side, the G20 are failing to engage the richer economies in providing the financial flows needed by developed countries, especially in adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage. So that's the point. In this sense, the developing countries, developing economies, which have the higher needs to finance adaptation and cover loss and damage, especially when we are more and more reaching the tipping points of climate emergence. And the burden burdening these poor countries with high financial costs and have loans. So it's not the case to provide just only more money, but to build an adequate financial instrument, financial supply for that. So it's time to talk about we economists usually to call the pecking order perspective about climate finance. So what can I say? Mitigation use can provide some direct cash flows. At the end, provides profit. So it could be easily financed by private initiative. In opposite nodes, adaptation and resilience is embedded in infrastructures and collective goods, which usually not provide direct cash flows. So loss and damage and adaptation and resilience, and especially loss and damage expenditure, has the need to encounter specific kinds of investment instruments. And what I mean is public finance. So we have to talk about the increased participation of public finance that's very needed for finance, especially adaptation and resilience, which is the major needs of the developing countries, and the opposite, the concern of the G20 in this moment, that is finance mitigation and not adaptation. And this kind of finance that, the needs to finance that with adequate financial instruments that have not gonna burden the poor countries with more debt, more unpayment debt. And it's a way to protect macroeconomic stability, globally speaking, that provides this country with a better financial instruments, with public finance, direct flows to adaptation. Well, I think that's the main message of the document. And I know, of course, the G20 are eclipsed by the copy. But as Maria Emilia told, the G20 can have a major role to endorse, to legitimate some agenda, and provide this kind of financial instruments, and provide public activism to finance adaptation is a major agenda, very important agenda to G20 to legitimate.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll go to Labour next, and then come to you all for questions and discussion. So Sarah and Rihanna, if we look at the sort of Labour and Labour rights agenda, I think in the report you talk about how precarious life is for workers all around the world. It'd be good to hear your assessment, including on how we protect and promote workers' rights in the transition to the US presidency of the G20, and what we might be able to hope for and work towards during next year when the US holds the chair of the G20.
I'm going to get to that. First, I wanted to say we are from the United States, and sorry my voice is kind of raspy today, but I wanted to say a couple things about the US boycott of the G20 summit. I know it's in all the headlines here, and I thought it would be weird coming from the US. This is my first time speaking here in Johannesburg, and I wanted to say a couple things about it. When I first heard that this was the decision of the US government, my response was that I felt like it was even more important for me and Rihanna and other Americans to come here to Johannesburg, because I think the people need to keep showing up. Whatever is happening at the governmental level, the people need to keep showing up, and we need to keep demanding multilateral economic cooperation that addresses the real crises that people are facing every day. And I also just want to thank all the South Africans who've been working so hard to organize the events that we're going to be taking part in this week, especially IEJ. Many of you are here. I've loved working with you on this report, and it's just phenomenal, all the responsibility you've taken on here, and we really appreciate it. So on the labor precarity issue, the fun part of working on this report for me was I got to interview a bunch of international labor leaders about what their experiences have been working on the G20 for a number of years, especially through this L20 engagement group, which brings together unions from around the world. And how would they use that to improve people's lives and reduce precariousness? And they could point to a few things that they were pretty proud of. They felt like they played a big role in pushing back in the early days for the coordinated stimulus plans among G20 countries in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, in a way that had helped prevent a global depression. More often, the things they could point to were the ways that they had mainstreamed issues that were really important to working people. The issue of inequality and labor's declining share of national income, and why we need to increase taxes on the rich to address that, and why we need to address the problem of rampant labor rights violations. There's been progress around just transition issues, especially around heat stress, which is affecting workers in so many countries in the world. And there's hope that by building momentum around that issue last year in Brazil, they could boost momentum for it in other arenas as well, like in the COP. And hopefully we'll hear something about that soon. On the issue of care economy, also, Brazil really put that into the mainstream at the highest level of public debate, and in a way that boosted momentum for national campaigns. Brazil passed national legislation coming out of that. So despite the fact that there are a few things you can point to that have been positive, all the labor leaders I talked to and everyone involved in this report agrees that we need transformative change, that the G20 has failed generally to improve lives for working people around the world, that they have focused, like Fernanda said, too much on containing crises to protect creditors and other wealthy people instead of dealing with the crises people are facing every day, from the shortage of good jobs to the lack of affordable housing to the rising inequality around the world. And one issue, I'll just mention one concrete issue I think we'll be pushing on the agenda next year, which is an emerging issue, is around artificial intelligence and how that's being adopted in the workplace and who gets to have a say over it. It's on the minds, I know, of a lot of people in the US. Our second biggest employer, Amazon, is looking at cutting 600,000 jobs in the next few years and turning those jobs over to robots. The data centers connected to AI are affecting communities around the world. If you're not seeing these issues playing out here quite yet, there are other ways it's going to affect you. If we've just got robots doing everything in the US, it means less customers for your exports, right? Now the problem is our tariffs, but someday it might be that, robots don't need your citrus and they're not going to be drinking South African wine. So that's an issue that we want to really drive into the G20 debate, and we think it's just one example of things that affect people, not in Global South, Global North, but really the majority of people around the world.
Yeah, and then just moving to the U.S. presidency in 2026, I will say we are already starting to build a broad coalition in the U.S. to take advantage of that spotlight of the U.S. G20 presidency to advance a multilateral and justice-focused agenda. So there will be an L20 organized by the International Trade Union Confederation and the AFL-CIO, which is our major labor federation, and that's most likely with no support from the US government. And that coalition will connect with efforts to push for climate justice and increase taxes on the rich and big corporations, among other issues. And then secondly, we're also building an educational campaign to engage trade union members and others in this effort. So a core message of that education and of the report we're launching today is that we need decisive and multilateral action to address the skyrocketing inequality that's not only causing so much economic suffering, but also driving the rise in authoritarianism and xenophobia in many countries around the world. So yeah, in a way, I think the current US government's approach is helping us make the case for multilateralism, because when you have the sort of one-on-one arm-twisting negotiations that we've seen, instead of more collective multilateralism, the wealthy and the powerful are even more likely to get what they want, while the rest of us kind of get the raw end of the deal. So recently, for example, the US has been using the tariffs as leverage to negotiate technology deals with a number of countries in the global north and south, with big tech corporations involved in those deals. And those tech corporations are getting what they want, while workers and consumers and communities are not. So yeah, I think it's really important going into the US G20 in 2026 that we help people understand how the welfare of people in the global north is inextricably linked with the welfare of people in the global south. And that's really on us. We have a lot of work to do in the US for sure, to make clear that high poverty and unemployment in the developing world weaken the bargaining power of workers in the US and other wealthy nations who are competing in a globalized labor pool. And when we have 3.4 billion people living in countries that spend more on servicing their debts than on education or healthcare, that's bad for people everywhere, all around the globe. So on top of the obvious moral issues with that, it means, like Sarah said, fewer consumers for exports and more vulnerability to pandemics and climate change, which are problems that know no national borders. So yeah, we're gonna continue to find ways to fight and stand together, and we look forward to working with many of our report partners and many of you to build that kind of people-to-people solidarity to achieve real economic justice.
Great, thank you. I think both of you made a really important point. I think for those of us who've been sort of watching these summits over the last, say, 20 years, I remember being in London in 2009 when the UK hosted that second leaders level summit. And most of us in civil society didn't think that the G20 was a credible institution. It was self-appointed. They had no liaison mechanisms at all. And then over the last 20 or so years, it's built up these, the C20s and the G20 and so on. And I think, as a report really nicely says, for better or for worse, the G20 has been good at fighting fires, financial fires, but it hasn't been good at fixing the foundations of the global economy. But as Sarah and Rana just said, well, that's fine. We could live with that, except we now have leaders who are intent on setting fire to the very institutions that we have, right? And which makes all the more important the mobilization of certainly civil society, but other actors to, continue with those key priorities that serve people and planet, that hold power to account, that mobilize beyond sort of a small number of us who are paying attention to these sorts of fora. So it does feel like a moment where we have to we have to salvage what's best of these institutions and processes and make the most of that and build power, as you said very nicely there. So it's now, I have more questions for the panel. I wanted to ask about Gilad about debt and Fernanda about extreme wealth, but it's over to you. Any more? Okay, so for Maria, Emilia, and Mandeep, I'm going to try to, just in case you didn't hear them, I'm going to try to summarize and group some of these wonderful questions. Thank you. There's a specific one about what is South Africa's sort of main issue? What will this G20 be known for? And also about wealth. What is the potential for the G20 to do more about wealth, given how much of a profile it got last year? We've got some specific questions about the UN and how it shows up, and is it really representative? And the UK and what we might hope for in 2027 if the UK does indeed confirm its presidency, beyond people just showing up and taking photos. I love that. Then we get three more interesting questions. Not that these weren't interesting, but more fundamental questions that I thought. One was around sort of social movement and the energy of what's happening on the streets. How do we translate that and help us transform power and how it works in these multilateral or elite spaces, which came up a couple of times. And then this question about the G20, is this really worth it? Those of us who go from summit to summit, just when things get serious, they become useless. I love that as well. And, is it all worth the effort? And then finally, what gives you hope? So there's a menu, a smorgasbord of questions and comments to choose from. You can pick and choose which you'd like to come back on. Take whatever order you.
Thanks. I'd like to have a lot of conversation here. I'll share. These questions raise good big picture thoughts. So let's first, the first thing I'd say is I think it's important, and the report goes some way in doing this, but I think we could do this more moving forward, is not to homogenize the G20 as a thing, right? Okay. To add to Maria Emilia's story on the UN tax convention, the Brazilian tax sort of like statement. What's really interesting about that example is that the Brazilians essentially circumvented the existing working groups of the G20 to establish this ministerial-led summit, which they hosted in like March, April of like that year. It had nothing to do with the G20 really in the formal sense of the G20, like working groups. And then they brought in the ministerial declaration to the July finance ministers meeting, and through like everyone feeling obligated because they were the like host, everyone kind of acquiesced to the finance like ministers meeting. The same sort of like story is true of the inequality report, which I mentioned during my opening, right? Where the inequality report, which is now going to have this profile and will be presented to the like leaders, is not a formal product of any working group, right? It's a presidency initiative outside of any working group, right? And they commissioned this panel of experts, and it was the South African government's initiative. No one signed off on it. It's not a consensus document. So in many ways, it's just leveraging the stage of the G20 to present a report to the world. So the G20 and some of the successes we've seen have been sometimes in circumventing the actual G20 is not this thing that you can talk about as a like singular process, right? It's this multifaceted sort of forum in which different contestations are busy playing out, and I think that's important because that provides us with some of the understanding of what can we use it for, where is it useful, where isn't it useful. On the UK, I think there's going to be two major things. The one is the question of the G20 architecture, which in the US administration will be radically pared back to not even all of the finance track, but the finance track minus climate, right? Okay, right? And the UK will be in a position, a very potentially very useful one, of being able to set the terms of the reconstituting of the G20, and it shouldn't go back to the status quo that exists now, because the status quo is legitimately an unwieldy mess, right? Also, as much as the US like kind of doging of the G20 is going to be its own shit show, right? The G20 needs some level of kind of like streamlining, trimming, real focus, some thought. So there's an architectural question for the UK around which groups it reconstitutes and how. There's also obviously a kind of topics question, right? Which is like, well, what should the focus issues be? I think, different of us have, I think they are sort of, the finance track has more long-term momentum kind of to it. I don't believe that wealth inequality has a future on the G20 agenda. I don't think it's going to get touched by the next few presidencies. I don't really think it's the place where we'll make progress on wealth inequality. But I do think there are some issues that have come to light in the last few years around energy transitions, green industrial policy, some of the climate financing stuff, which have enough sort of UK like resonance to appeal to sort of UK leadership to be like sold, but have enough global like relevance to be sort of like taken up. And we could unpack a bit more of some of those like lists, which I'd be happy to do. I do think linked to that it is a real question. Is this like, what will the reconstitution of the G20 post the US look like? And will it be the beginning of the end of the G20 when the G20 got used by the global South in the way that we've seen in the last few years? I think it's an open question, really. I think the future of the G20 to me is not sort of set in stone. You do see sort of the contestations which were most relevant to kind of global multilateralism in the like 90s took place in the WTO, right? No one really talks about the WTO in the same way now than we did in the late 90s. There is this kind of rise and fall of different like multilateral fora, and I think it's, I don't have a good answer, but I think it's a very real possibility. Is it worth it, and if so, why? To me, it is. To me, you like movements have to talk to movements and collections of those of us who want to, interested in social change, have to talk to power, right? Okay, it's part of the process of creating sort of like change, and you have to talk to power where power gathers, right? And that's not always the terms that you can set. What I think you can set is how you talk to power and on what issues in those spaces and through what means. So for me, should civil society put its effort into something like the C20, an official engagement group of the G20? Absolutely not. Right? Okay, that's a platform for like co-option. In my view, it has almost no impact on, as are most of the W20 and the T20, and they have almost no influence like whatsoever. So we can set. I think that the G20 is where power gathers, and therefore we have to engage with it and articulate a set of demands to it. What we can decide, though, is on what terms and through what means we are going to speak to it. And to me, we shouldn't be speaking to it through formal engagement group channels as an instance. I would love to see in coming years mass mobilization outside of the G20 in the way that we saw in Seattle for the WTO. And that was not because the WTO is either legitimate or illegitimate. It was because power was gathering and kind of coalescing in that institution at that moment. So the question for me is more like, how do we best shape the way in which we engage with the G20, and that isn't shaped on the terms of the hegemonic countries and the hegemonic institutions. I've spoken a lot, so I've covered it, so let me leave it there.
Brilliant, thank you. And you've successfully renamed the C20 the co-opted 20. I love that.
Different C20s have played like different roles, right? There's value in collective gatherings of civil society at various times, but I don't think it's a vehicle for voice.
No, point well made. So we've got just over 10 minutes, otherwise we end up overstaying the Civicus welcome. So shall I go from Maria Emilia, then Mandeep, Fernanda, and in the room this way, if that makes sense. So Maria Emilia, I hope you heard some of those questions. Any reflections on what you've heard?
Yeah, very brief and very hard to go after Neil's. That would be very remarks. But I'm thinking of something hopeful. I think on top of the point of the G20 and doing working around it's more so with an independent commission or like promoting social participation in the finance track outside the formal participation channels as Brazil did. I think there's also many conversations that happen in the margins of the G20 that are very valuable. Even this conversation, by connecting the national and the international in ways that are hard, in different spaces, connecting civil society across the globe, trying to find common for demand. I think that's a value, and it's common to many multilateral processes. Like even international treaties that have little binding force, there's evidence that they end up promoting this legal and social mobilization around them, which to me is something to also have a fall to, and something positive. And I think when we started writing this report, we faced that debate of saying, well, what do? We kind of fuel the criticism to multilateralism in the context and the shape it is right now. Or we think of how to maybe reimagine how it works to build something better. And I think we erred on the second option. There's a brief comment on the UN. Its limitations are obvious, but at least, for instance, in the tax convention process, we do see the value had of a procedural justice that we cannot see, for instance, in the OECD. So regardless of the outcome of the process, we can see each country have to keep pushing a voting and expressing its concerns, even if they don't land in the text in ways that they cannot do elsewhere. We see people from ministries of finance for very little use to hearing CSOs demands, needing to hear this and that, and having to engage with issues of development and human rights and gender justice, but they typically do not confront. So just a positive note of the UN, and this is a good example on procedural justice in that sense.
Thank you. Andy?
So just reflecting on some of the questions which are really insightful. On the Generation Z, now in the US, what we call the Generation Z protests. Whether the protests that took place in Nepal or the ones that are taking place in Serbia, they really are actually an indication of people's frustration against the policies that the G20 has actually been championing over the years, which is, shrinking the public sphere and really leading to monetization of public services and hiving off huge parts of the state to the private sector. And that's where young people are feeling frustrated because they're seeing so much wealth accumulation, which the G20 has been pushing through the international financial institutions. At the same time, I think that's also what gives me hope, because people are becoming much more alive to what's happening with regards to wealth accumulation and the skewed economic policies that the larger powers have arrogated for themselves and pushed on to smaller states. So there is some change happening, and that change is slowly going to become into quite a powerful force as we'll see down the line, and which is also related very much. It's interlinked to the frustrations with governance, the corruption, and denial of agency to people. On the UN 80 process, I know there was a question there. The UN 80 process is a convoluted process, really. The UN 80 reforms, the trigger for it, of course, was the US's threats to full back funding for the UN. But they were also long overdue, because the UN itself is a sprawling, bureaucratic institution that unfortunately, for various reasons, including leadership, has actually failed to live up to its promise of being the conscience of the world, and the UN, in fact, had got into very practical, service delivery more. So the UN's real purpose really is to ensure there's proactive diplomacy to prevent war, and to ensure accountability for very serious human rights violations, and of course to push conditions for social progress. But the UN's emphasis over the last few years has actually been on humanitarian relief and response. That was the easy way to provide the balm after the crisis had passed, or the wars had stopped. And that's been long overdue. The challenge with the G20 countries is, in fact, there's real skewed levels of spending and how much the G20 countries actually support the UN. If it was a fair world, we would have a much straightforward way of funding the UN that could be based on a small percentage of a country's gross national income. There are some states that pay so less because of this this formula that the UN uses to fund itself of a country's GNI compared to its debt, and then this whole negotiation that happens behind closed doors. if a country would just have to pay a small amount percentage of its GNI, the UN could be adequately funded. It could and the big states could not say that they have control over certain institutions. So if the G20 is really serious about solving world problems, then they should do that. But if you really look at even the contributions of the G20 states, which are supposed to be the 20 biggest economies, 19 was the European Union, it's skewed. So there's some change needs to happen there. And on the last question, I think the last question I want to answer was Gino's question about should we be chasing the coattails of all these spaces, where power is already, is organized and they're self-perpetuating institutions. It's truly civil society organization to its own. I mean, these institutions are going to continue to function. So we have to decide whether we want to be outside, inside and outside. And and according to our own capacities. In our own work at Civicus, we don't spend too much time and energy into G20 because we believe that it could be better used elsewhere. But we also don't want to completely ignore the process and be strategic in how much we can influence. So there's no easy answer there, but we have to also continue to engage with radical optimism and also come forward to reform these institutions and actually bring them back to their roots, because they make decisions for peoples of the world, but they're not representative of the peoples of the world.
Thank you, Mandeep. Fanan.
Right, trying to be very brief and just taking Mandeep's cue that it's complex. It's very, very difficult, and the questions were amazing and touch on many different things that we could talk for hours about. So I'll just say a few points of things that got in my head as the questions were asked. I think the first thing is, instead of trying to fight or resist rather change, we need to mobilize, our resources to shape and redesign. So be the crisis of multilateralism, it had to be changed anyway, the system, be the UN reform, everything. I mean, obviously, as our report outlines the outcomes, I mean, the reality of the world, and for most people is not good, so there's lots of things that need to change anyway. So I think, putting our resources to good use is really, and we need to use all the different sections of society, right? It is social movements, it is, the existing institutions. But again, as our report highlights, there are many different initiatives and institutions out there that are not being used to its full potential, right? They're not being legitimized because they sit on the margins of what it's right now the dominant narratives and systems. So talk about different regional banks. I mean, even yesterday I was at a debt event talking in the African context, and solutions proposed about how if African nations were to borrow within a system that worked within the continent instead of relying on foreign creditors, things could be different. So all this kind of reframing of the issue, and really, again, going back to the report, like when we identify extreme wealth accumulation as kind of a missing variable in all these debates, we really need to be more clear and articulate about what the actual problems are. Because, if we really confront them, which is obviously something the G20 is not going to be doing willingly, because it's about power confrontation, it's about, giving up power, in many ways, and people are not willing, and countries and nations are not willing to do that. So we, everyone who is committed to a cause of economic justice, I think we need to be better just articulating really, and not being afraid to present the challenge as is, because that's when we can open up the conversation for real solutions. And I'll just say one more point, just acknowledging the context, because it's not we can't be too, we have a starting point here, which is very challenging. And Mandeep talked about, the kind of attack on civil organizing and rights. Our report outlines how, for example, with unionization rates, so in terms of labor force organizing, they are declining in many economies. And there's a report of last year by the International Trade Union Confederation saying that 87% of countries now violate the right to strike, and 80% of institutions the right to collective bargaining. And this is, to me, it's crucial because any theory of change around, delivering a more just global economic system requires, mobilization and collective building of power to really challenge, such dominant and powerful norms. And that's the context we're working with. So again, I don't have the solution completely, but I think the first step is that we all kind of, acknowledge that context and really work to solve those problems.
Thank you. Sarah and Rana.
I'll take a crack at the hope question, bravely. Not easy, but I was laughing when Gilad brought up the Battle of Seattle against the WTO in 1999, because I'm guessing I might be the only person here who was actually in Seattle for that. And so you get a sense of how I've spent a lot of my career critiquing our existing multilateral institutions. And now here I find myself, rallying for multilateralism. But I think we've been really clear in the report that we need a different form of multilateralism. And I guess where I'm trying to find some hope is, could we build something really new out of the current global upheaval and the current global chaos? Is this our moment, finally, for really pushing for something different? I'd like to see that there might be a silver lining in there.
Yeah, I'll also piggyback on the hope question of, I think I see a lot of hope just in seeing the power of civil society already and how it engages with the G20 and beyond. As we saw in Brazil last year, there was a really robust kind of civil society presence. And then this year, in a couple days, the We the 99% People Summit. So I think people are really paying attention to these global forums. And there is kind of momentum already being built, and that needs to continue to be built. And then also just outside of the G20 at COP30 last week, we saw all of the international and local indigenous activists really coming together and really making their voice heard in these global fora. So I think there's a lot of examples of civil society showing its power, and to just keep building on that will be crucial.
Thank you, Margaret.
Just very quick, brief comments, try to dialogue with all the questions. I'd like to insist my point that the importance to taking a broader perspective about economic stability, because when we think about a broader perspective in economic stability, we talk about the position of to put the right instruments of climate financing, but also providing economic development for poor countries, economic transformation, access to new technologies, good job opportunities. All these are involved in create and reinforce the legitimacy of a form that once was created to think about economic stability, to create a more broader perspective and includes more the global South countries. And it's important to highlight this because the gravitation center of the G20 are moving again to the north. So we have to attempt this perspective that when we talk about economic stability to the global south, we talk about a lot of issues that are not included in this discussion in the G20.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you to the panel, and thank you all for joining us. I'm sorry we ran a little bit over time. I do encourage you, if you haven't already, to pick up the executive summary of the report or download the full one. And let me try to conclude on a hopeful note as well, because when I read the report, I saw the contours of the sorts of issues that matter to people in PAT, right? What the bond markets are doing, or what private investors want, or what are the interests of multinational corporations, are not what are the concerns that matter to people. It is about, can you earn a decent living and have your rights protected? Can you afford the basics in life? Can we manage to leverage enough financial resource to address climate change, and so on? And so if you look at the themes in the report, I think there's a sort of it's a framework for thinking about what an alternative economic agenda might look like. And Adrian's gone, but he asked the question about, what can we salvage in time for a UK presidency in 2027? amidst all of the chaos and challenge that is likely to unfold over the next 12 months during 26. And some of us are having a conversation about saying, building on Gilad's point, well, what if we did things on our own terms? What if we didn't have to go and sit on the fringes of other people's summits and be invited in sort of, to consultations, or what I often think of as insultations, but we're sort of tokenized. What if we had a conversation about those issues on our terms and came up with an alternative framework, an alternative ambition, an alternative manifesto, an alternative people's declaration, whatever it is? The good news is, one of the wonderful things about this partnership is there are these 5 organizations and many other allies around the world. There's no shortage of amazing economic ideas and action. Right? We can challenge these orthodoxies. We can rewire and reimagine what a human economy might look like. We just need to sort of take that power, build on the energy that's on the streets, and challenge and deliver a new sort of infrastructure for how we make decisions at the global. So we need to, you use the sausage factory analogy. For the last 20 years, we've assumed the sausages will be made by very rich, influential, powerful people behind closed doors, and it will be a very extractive sausage that very few of us will get to taste. But we can imagine a sausage factory that makes vegan sausages that are carbon neutral, that taste good, that can be eaten by everyone in a sustainable and happy way. And so, please let me lead you on that sausage note. Still food outside and some drinks, so please stay if you can. But thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the sun.